What happens when two comedy titans collide in the most explosive late-night television meltdown ever caught on camera? You won't believe what unfolds when a routine celebrity interview turns to a career-ending confrontation that has the entire entertainment industry buzzing. Last night's episode of Jimmy Kimmel Live delivered raw, unfiltered drama that money can't buy, leaving viewers shocked and social media in chaos. The tension was palpable from the moment Conan O'Brien walked onto the Jimmy Kimmel Live set. What the studio audience expected to be a lighthearted reunion between two comedy veterans quickly became something far more sinister. Kimmel, known for his sometimes abrasive interviewing style, seemed particularly on edge as his guest settled into the interview chair. The first red flag appeared during Kimmel's opening monologue, where he made pointed jokes about has-been talk show hosts trying to stay relevant in the streaming era. Comments many interpreted as direct shots at O'Brien's recent career moves. As the interview began, Kimmel's usual charm felt forced and artificial. His first question to Conan came loaded with underlying hostility. "So, Conan, how does it feel to be back on a real television network after your little vacation in the digital wilderness?" The question landed like a slap, and O'Brien's expression shifted from friendly anticipation to genuine surprise. The studio audience offered only scattered, uncomfortable laughter. O'Brien, ever the professional, attempted to deflect with humor. "Well, Jimmy, I've always enjoyed visiting the minor leagues occasionally." But Kimmel wasn't interested in playful banter. Instead of laughing, he leaned forward with a predatory smile and pressed harder. "That's interesting coming from someone whose show got canceled more times than a gym membership in January." The audience fell silent, and several crew members exchanged worried glances behind the cameras. The conversation spiraled as Kimmel seemed determined to undermine his guest at every turn. When O'Brien tried to discuss his latest projects, Kimmel interrupted repeatedly, making sarcastic comments about desperate attempts to recapture past glory and relying on outdated comedy formulas. What should have been a standard promotional interview was rapidly becoming a public humiliation session, with Kimmel clearly enjoying his role as the aggressor. The breaking point came when Kimmel brought up O'Brien's well-documented Tonight Show controversy from over a decade ago. "You know, Conan, I've always wondered, do you ever regret not handling that whole NBC situation with a little more maturity?" The question hung in the air like a toxic cloud, and O'Brien's composure finally began to crack. His jaw tightened, his hands clenched slightly, and for the first time in decades, he looked genuinely angry on television. "Excuse me?" O'Brien's voice carried a dangerous edge that veteran late-night viewers had never heard. The studio went dead quiet, even the usually chatty audience holding their breath. Kimmel, seemingly oblivious to the volcano he was poking, doubled down. "I mean, the way you handled that transition was pretty unprofessional. Maybe if you'd been more of a team player, things would have worked out differently." The words hit O'Brien like physical blows, and his demeanor transformed. Gone was the affable, self-deprecating comedian America had loved for decades. In his place sat a man who had clearly reached his absolute limit. "Jimmy," he said, his voice now ice-cold and controlled, "I think you might want to be very careful about where you take this conversation." Kimmel, either drunk on his own power or simply too arrogant to recognize the danger, pushed further. He leaned back with a smug expression and delivered what would prove to be the fatal blow. "Oh, come on, Conan. We're all friends here. Surely you can handle a little constructive criticism about your career choices. I mean, it's not like you haven't given us plenty of material to work with over the years." The studio audience shifted uncomfortably, sensing they were witnessing something unprecedented and potentially career-destroying. O'Brien's hands were visibly shaking, not with fear, but with barely contained rage. His legendary quick wit, usually his greatest weapon, seemed momentarily paralyzed by Kimmel's audacity. "Constructive criticism, O'Brien," he repeated slowly, each word dripping with controlled fury. "Is that what we're calling this ambush? His voice rose slightly, and for the first time in the interview, he looked directly into the camera instead of at his host. The gesture felt like a desperate appeal to the viewers at home, a silent plea for them to witness what was really happening. Kimmel, apparently mistaking O'Brien's momentary silence for weakness, pressed his advantage. "Look, I'm just saying what everyone in the industry has been thinking. Sometimes the truth hurts, but maybe it's time someone said it to your face instead of behind your back." The cruelty in his voice was unmistakable, and several audience members could be heard gasping audibly. What happened next would become the stuff of television legend. But first, you need to understand just how completely Kimmel had miscalculated the situation he was creating. O'Brien slowly placed his hands on the armrests of his chair and leaned forward, his famous towering height suddenly seeming more intimidating than comedic. "Jimmy," he said, his voice carrying the weight of 3 decades in show business, "I came here tonight as a colleague, as someone who shared the same stages, the same struggles, the same dream of making people laugh. But what you're doing right now, this isn't comedy. This isn't even entertainment. This is just cruel." The words landed with devastating precision. For the first time since the interview began, Kimmel's cocky facade began to crack. His smile faltered slightly, but his ego wouldn't let him back down. "Please, Conan, don't be so dramatic. This is television. If you can't handle a little heat, maybe you should have stayed retired." That word "retired" hit O'Brien like a physical blow. His eyes flashed with something that made several front row audience members actually lean back in their seats. "Retired," he repeated, his voice rising for the first time. "Jimmy, I've been working longer than you've been on television. I was doing late night when you were still trying to get stage time at open mics." The studio atmosphere had become electric with tension. Crew members were frantically signaling to producers, clearly unsure whether to cut to commercial or let this unprecedented meltdown continue. Kimmel, perhaps realizing he had gone too far, but unable to find a graceful exit, decided to double down instead. "Experience doesn't mean much if nobody's watching anymore, does it?" The audience gasped audibly. Several people could be heard whispering, "Oh my God," and "This is insane." In the deadly quiet that followed, O'Brien's face went through a series of expressions: shock, hurt, and finally, cold fury. When he spoke again, his voice was controlled but carried an undercurrent of volcanic rage that seemed to vibrate through the studio. "Nobody's watching." O'Brien stood up slowly, his full 6 feet 4 inches frame towering over the seated Kimmel. "Jimmy, let me tell you something about watching. When I was fighting for my dream at NBC, taking risks, pushing boundaries, trying to elevate this medium we both claim to love, where were you? You were watching from the sidelines, taking notes, learning how to copy what real innovators were creating." Kimmel's face flushed red, his carefully maintained composure finally beginning to crumble. "Copy? I built my own career. Conan, I didn't ride anyone's coattails, did I?" O'Brien's voice cut through the studio like a blade. "Your entire approach, your interview style, even your desk placement hits, all borrowed from people who came before you. And now you have the audacity to sit there and mock the very people whose work you've been imitating for years." The confrontation had reached a fever pitch, with both men now standing facing each other across the interview area like gladiators in an arena. The audience sat in stunned silence, many holding up phones to record what was clearly becoming television history. Kimmel's producers were gesturing frantically from the wings, but their host seemed completely oblivious to everything except the man standing across from him. "At least I know how to stay relevant," Kimmel shot back, his voice now shaky with barely controlled anger. "At least I don't have to beg streaming services for handouts or resort to cheap podcast gimmicks to stay in the public eye." The words hung in the air like poison, and O'Brien's expression shifted to something that made veteran entertainment reporters later describe as genuinely frightening. His voice, when it came, was barely above a whisper. but somehow more powerful than if he had shouted. Cheap gimmicks. O'Brien stepped closer to Kimmel's desk, his presence now dominating the entire set. Jimmy, do you want to talk about cheap? Let's talk about building a career on mean-spirited pranks and celebrity humiliation. Let's talk about confusing cruelty with comedy, bullying with entertainment. You want to know what's cheap? This interview, this pathetic attempt to tear down someone who paved the way for your entire career. Kimmel was visibly shaking now, whether from anger or fear, it wasn't clear. You're out of line, Conan. Way out of line, am I? O'Brien's laugh was harsh and humorless. I'm out of line for defending myself against your unprovoked attack, for refusing to sit here and let you humiliate me for your audience's entertainment. You invited me here under false pretenses. Jimmy, you lied to me, to my representatives, to everyone involved. This wasn't an interview. It was an ambush. The truth of those words seemed to hit everyone in the studio simultaneously. The audience began murmuring among themselves, clearly realizing they had been complicit in what was essentially a public execution disguised as entertainment. Several people in the front rows looked genuinely uncomfortable, as if they wanted to leave but couldn't tear themselves away from the spectacle. Kimmel, perhaps finally understanding the magnitude of his mistake, tried to regain control. Look, maybe we got off on the wrong foot here. Why don't we just know? O'Brien's voice cut him off with surgical precision. We're way past wrong feet, Jimmy. We're in territory that can't be walked back from. You made a choice tonight. You decided to use your platform, your power, your position to try to destroy someone who came here in good faith. And for what? Ratings. Some twisted sense of superiority. The confrontation had now completely spiraled beyond anything anyone in the studio had ever witnessed. This wasn't just the comedians having a disagreement. This was a full-scale character assassination attempt that had backfired spectacularly. O'Brien's righteous anger was palpable, filling the studio like an electrical storm, while Kimmel looked increasingly small and petty by comparison. But the most explosive moment was yet to come, and what O'Brien said next would trigger a response that would make headlines around the world. O'Brien took a deep breath. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of someone who had finally decided to reveal a long-held truth. You know what, Jimmy? I think it's time people knew who you really are behind the cameras. You want to talk about my career? Let's talk about yours. Let's talk about how you got this show. Kimmel's face went pale. Conan, don't, what? Don't tell the truth. O'Brien's voice rose, his famous composure completely abandoned. Now, don't mention how you spent years bad-mouthing other hosts to network executives. Don't talk about the meetings where you actively campaigned against your supposed friends and colleagues. The studio fell into a silence so complete that the hum of the air conditioning became audible. Audience members were leaning forward, sensing they were about to hear something that had been kept secret for years. Kimmel looked genuinely panicked now. His earlier bravado had completely evaporated. That's enough, Kimmel said desperately, but his voice cracked on the words. Visit. O'Brien stepped even closer to the desk. Because I remember a very different Jimmy Kimmel when you were starting out. I remember someone who begged for advice, for introductions, for opportunities. I remember helping you, Jimmy. We all did. And this is how you repay that kindness, by trying to destroy the people who lifted you up. The revelation hit the studio like a bomb. Several audience members could be heard gasping, and one person in the back actually said, "Oh my God," loud enough for the microphones to pick up. Kimmel was now visibly sweating, his hands shaking as he gripped the edge of his desk. "You're making things up," Kimmel stammered, but his voice lacked any conviction. "Am I?" O'Brien pulled out his phone. "Because I still have the text messages, Jimmy. The ones where you thanked me for recommending you to ABC executives. The ones where you called me your mentor. Should I read them out loud? The threat hung in the air like a sword over Kimmel's head. His face cycled through several emotions: fear, anger, desperation, and finally, something approaching rage. When he spoke again, his voice was different, uglier, stripped of any pretense of professional courtesy. "You sanctimonious piece of garbage," Kimmel snarled, finally showing his true colors. "You think you're better than everyone else, don't you? You think because you have some cult following that you're comedy royalty?" The mask had completely fallen away, revealing something that made several audience members visibly recoil. This wasn't the Jimmy Kimmel they thought they knew. This was someone driven by jealousy, resentment, and a deep-seated need to tear others down. O'Brien stared at him for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice was filled with something approaching pity. "There it is. There's the real Jimmy Kimmel. You know what's tragic about this whole thing? You actually had talent once. You could have built something meaningful instead of this empire of spite and manufactured controversy." "Don't you dare lecture me about—" "I'm not lecturing you," O'Brien interrupted. "I'm done with you. Completely done." He began unhooking his microphone, his movements deliberate and final. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, addressing the audience directly, "I apologize that you had to witness this. You came here expecting entertainment, and instead, you got to see what happens when someone mistakes cruelty for comedy." Kimmel jumped up from behind his desk, his face red with fury. "You can't just walk away. This is my show." O'Brien turned back to face him one last time, his expression one of complete contempt. "Your show, Jimmy. After tonight, I'm not sure you'll have a show much longer. You just revealed exactly who you are to millions of people, and I don't think they're going to like what they saw." The prophecy in those words would prove more accurate than anyone could have imagined. Several audience members were already posting clips to social media, and the hashtag the Kimmel meltdown was beginning to trend worldwide. "Security!" Kimmel screamed, apparently forgetting that this was live television and millions of people were watching him completely lose control. "Get him out of here." But O'Brien was already walking toward the exit, his dignity intact despite everything that had happened. As he reached the edge of the stage, he turned back one final time and delivered the line that would be quoted in entertainment journalism for years to come. "Jimmy, I genuinely hope you find whatever it is you're looking for, but you won't find it by tearing other people down. That's not comedy. That's just sadness disguised as success." With that, Conan O'Brien walked off the set of Jimmy Kimmel Live, leaving behind a host who was still screaming at his retreating figure, a stunned studio audience, in what would become the most talked about late-night television moment in decades. The show cut to commercial immediately, but the damage was already done. Within minutes, clips of the confrontation were spreading across every social media platform. The consensus was swift and brutal. Kimmel had revealed himself to be exactly what O'Brien had accused him of being: a bully who had built his career on the backs of people he now sought to destroy. By the next morning, major sponsors were pulling their advertisements. Network executives were fielding angry calls from viewers, celebrities, and other industry professionals. The entertainment press was unanimous in their condemnation of Kimmel's behavior, with many calling it the most unprofessional display they had ever witnessed on television. O'Brien, meanwhile, received an outpouring of support from colleagues, fans, and even former rivals who praised his restraint and dignity in the face of an unprovoked attack. His handling of the situation was universally praised as masterful. He had defended himself without stooping to Kimmel's. Levelin had walked away with his reputation not just intact, but enhanced. Incident became a case study in how quickly a career built on questionable foundations can crumble. When exposed to scrutiny, Kimmel's ratings plummeted immediately, never to recover to their previous levels. The man who had tried to destroy a comedy legend had instead destroyed himself, providing a cautionary tale about the dangers of confusing cruelty with entertainment. In the end, The confrontation revealed everything audiences needed to know about both men, and the verdict was clear about who the real villain had been all along.